Greetings and welcome to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Peter Mandeville, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the center. At Georgetown, I lead the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're grateful to you for joining us. We're delighted to welcome to the Berkeley Center today Professor Guilherme Casaroes from the Getulio Vargas Foundation Business School in Sao Paulo, and Professor Amy Erica Smith from Iowa State University. Their presentation today will explore the sources of Brazil's religious soft power. While the political rise of Jair Bolsonaro and the Christian Social Party has certainly generated an increased focus on the role of religion and conservative evangelicals in particular in Brazilian domestic politics, we've not heard as much about the international and transnational dimensions of this phenomenon. And this is the topic our speakers will address today. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read out their full bios, but rather will put links in the chat box that you can click in order to read their impressive profiles. I'll also include a link to the main landing page for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're also excited that in 2021, the project will be publishing not one, but two edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one of which will feature a chapter jointly authored by today's speakers. Before I hand things over to Professors Casaroes and Smith, just a few brief words about logistics and our format today. I wanted to let everyone know that this session will be recorded for the benefit of those who are not able to join us for the live talk, and all of you who registered to attend the event today will receive a link to the video once it becomes available. After our speakers make their initial remarks, we'll have a period of time available for discussion, questions, and answers. You can participate in that by using the Q&A control, which should be at the bottom, usually, of your Zoom controls. That'll open a window that you can use and open at any point during our session today to type your question in. And I will then be posing a selection of those questions and comments to our speakers after they finish. So without further ado, let me once again welcome Professors Casaroes and Smith and hand things over to them.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for the invitation. We're delighted to be here with you guys today, virtually. Greetings from snowy Iowa and my friend, the snowman. The virtual snowman. Yeah, so thank you very much for participation. This is a really great initiative, and we're delighted to be a part of it, to be able to contribute our perspectives on the Brazilian perspective to this larger cross-national endeavor. The title for our presentation and the chapter we're contributing to this edited volume comes from a saying, the campaign slogan, actually, of Brazil's current president, Jair Bolsonaro. I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about what this means. So I'm going to start, though, not with Jair Bolsonaro, but with one of his predecessors, Jânio Quadros, a short-lived president in the early 1960s. His presidency was short-lived. Jânio Quadros lived for longer. But Jânio Quadros was part of a movement of politicians who tried to define a middle way for Brazilian foreign policy and independent foreign policy. In a 1961 article that Jânio Quadros published in Foreign Affairs, Jânio Quadros made the following declaration: "We must choose those of our country's sources of inspiration that can best be mobilized to assist the national effort. Because of our historical, cultural, and Christian background, as well as our geographical situation, ours is a predominantly Western nation." Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that sentence is doing, what the assumption of a Christian identity is doing in an international context. In this context in which Quadros is writing, definition of Brazil as a Christian nation in international affairs is intended to define where Brazil fits in a civilizational sense, and to define its natural allies in that civilizational sense. So he's effectively saying we are part of the Christian Western world. We belong to a bloc of nations that includes countries such as the United States, Europe. So he is positioning Brazil in an international space. At the same time, when Jânio Quadros says this, he's saying this specifically for international audiences. And in this context, Jânio Quadros is not making what he perceives to be a domestically controversial declaration. In fact, he's making this declaration because he perceives it to be domestically non-controversial. He perceives this to be a unifying national identity that all Brazilians can get behind in order to define where Brazil sits in the political spectrum. So we're going to compare this to 60 years, nearly 60 years later, one of his successors, Jair Bolsonaro. So in 2017, before the official campaign, 2018 campaign had begun, Jair Bolsonaro, as he was a pre-candidate for president, made the following quote, which has become famous. It's part of sort of the lore of Bolsonaro, is this particular quote that I'm reading to you. God above everything. Forget that little story about the state being secular. The state is Christian, and the minority who's against it should move away. Minorities need to bow to majorities. So he took that the first sentence there from that quote and actually turned it into part of his campaign slogan. So we have here on the right one of the campaign ads for Jair Bolsonaro as he was running for president, or well, I guess this is after he became president. So the slogan is Brazil above everything, God above everyone. So the difference in these quotes, ostensibly, in some sense, these are quotes that are both defining the Brazilian nation as being Christian. But what's happening in these statements are dramatically different stories about what the role is of Christian identity here. So this statement here, as Jair Bolsonaro has adopted it, is one in which Christianity is seen as a wedge issue, really, a controversial statement. This is a pugnacious declaration of Brazil as a Christian state and nation that's intended to alienate, basically to trigger the libs. It's intended to alienate leftists and maybe moderates in the Brazilian political context and attract a different political base. At the same time, he's also asserting a kind of a Christian nationalism that positions Brazil in an international sphere. It's not so obvious here, but in a larger context, seen in a larger context, we can see that that Bolsonaro is positioning Brazil as one player within a larger international coalition of right-wing political leaders, right-wing Christian political leaders, who are supporting basically Christian nationalism globally across individual nations. So ironically, while Bolsonaro declared Brazil above everything, Bolsonaro's actual sort of, if you look at his larger worldview and the larger sort of geopolitical context in which he imagined he was positioning Brazil, it becomes clear that he is actually positioning Brazil as a player within this larger global coalition of Christian actors, but not necessarily as the one that is above everything. In fact, Bolsonaro is positioning Brazil within Brazil as a player, as a supporting player to a US-led Christian coalition, which he imagines Trump in particular is leading. And one can see this sort of hierarchy in various speeches of Bolsonaro's, as well as speeches by other sort of supporting players within his domestic coalition, people like Ernesto Araújo, who's Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as the pundit Olavo de Carvalho, who has been really important for defining the agenda of the Bolsonaro administration. Okay, so in the next about 15, 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk with you guys about what explains this change. So Guilherme and I are going to outline three hypotheses explaining the religious use of soft power. I think at some point in some draft we said we were going to test these. We're not testing them. We are outlining several hypotheses that have some relevant evidence that can support them. And we're developing really a qualitative argument that suggests various reasons that Brazilian presidents are using religious soft power. These reasons, these hypotheses, by the way, have parallels to religious use of soft power in widely varying contexts around the world. So those of you who are working on this topic, you're not going to see anything new here, but we're going to explain how these hypotheses relate in particular to the Brazilian context. So the first hypothesis is that Brazilian presidents are using religious soft power as a way of constructing a national identity. So what I've just been talking about in terms of the difference between Quadros and Bolsonaro. The second hypothesis is that presidents are using religious soft power to build coalitions vis-a-vis international actors, so that is, for instance, positioning Brazil in alliance with a Western, for instance, Quadros positioning Brazil in alliance with Western entities, and subsequent presidents positioning Brazil in other ways for construction of alliances. And then the final is that Brazilian presidents are using religious soft power, are exerting religious soft power really at the behest of domestic political actors and social movements, as a means of maintaining coalitions within, or to support their own administrations within the context of domestic democratic political struggles. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Guilherme, who is going to who's first going to provide an overview of soft power in Brazil, and then we're going to run through the three hypotheses. You will see a lot of switching back and forth between Guilherme and me over the next 15, 20 minutes or so. That's because we're passing the baton to talk about the areas that we know best of our own presentation. So you'll have to put up with sort of a rotating.
Thank you, Amy, Erica. Thank you, Peter. I'm thrilled to be here. You know, 11 months ago, we would be convening in Washington, D.C. to talk about those issues. We had to postpone a lot of things thanks to the pandemic, but now I'm so happy to be able to finally be together with all of you to talk about one of the most interesting discussions that we have in Brazilian foreign policy nowadays, which relates to the role of religion and how religion has been used as a form of soft power in the Brazilian context. So you can move a slide forward, please. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is why has soft power been such an important piece of Brazil's diplomatic and foreign policy strategy. Even though, as Amy Erica said, you may find many different usages of religious soft power in foreign policy strategies of countries all over the globe, Brazil has a very unique story related to the role of soft power. We can go as far as to say that Brazil is a quintessential soft power nation in the sense that it has always presented itself as a country whose diplomatic resources have always been more important than economic resources or even military capabilities. And there is a reason for that, which is a reason related to Brazil's historical construction. Diplomacy has been a key to the formation of the Brazilian state. This is something that maybe foreign audiences are not so familiar with. Brazilian students are probably more familiar with the commonplace notion that Brazil as a country has been formed or has been shaped by basically three international treaties. The Treaty of Tordesillas back in 1494, the Treaty of Madrid back in 1750, and then the Treaty of Petrópolis in 1903, And basically, three treaties formed Brazil's territorial boundaries. And this is not like any other country in the world whose territorial formation is mostly related to wars, to economic expansion, to colonization, and so on and so forth. So Brazil has a very special history when it comes to the role of diplomacy in shaping the boundaries of the state. And diplomacy has also been a ticket to Brazil's international recognition. Brazil is the kind of country that we might call, following George Kennan's definition, a monster country. And that basically means that Brazil has huge territorial and resource assets. And that has been something that pretty much defined Brazil's role in the world. A country with a huge territory, with a very large population. Today, we are probably the 5th or the 6th largest population in the world. And also a lot of natural resources such as water, minerals, and so on and so forth. The thing is that Brazil has never been able to match its vast territory with hard forms of power. Brazil has been a giant country, but not really an economic power, or at least up until the last 20 years. Brazil has never been a military power either. So diplomacy has been used across centuries as the most important tool for Brazil's foreign policy strategy and for Brazil's position in the world. If we look at the history of the 20th century Brazil, soft power has allowed the country to play the role of a middle power over most of the century. So even though Brazil is a large country, Brazil has always acted as a middle power. And if we go back to the textbook definition of what a middle power is, it's basically a country whose international reputation is based on values. There's a typo here, so it's not value-based, but values-based or principle-based foreign policy. And this is what Brazil has been, especially from the mid-20th century onwards. So what are the values that Brazil believes in? It's basically three: universalism, in the sense that Brazil wants to be friends with pretty much every other country around the world; development, which is the notion that every developing country deserves to be respected, to have their own place in the global economy. So development is pretty much what connects us to the developing world or to the global south. And finally, multilateralism. There are so many specialists relating the role of middle powers in the world with multilateral structures. Basically, middle powers are the one who sustain multilateralism over the course of years. So basically, those are the three values Brazil has stood up for in the past several decades. Soft power has also been very important as a tool for Brazil's regional integration initiatives. So we might call it soft leadership. Basically, rather than coercing other countries into joining Brazil's regional project, or rather than bribing some countries into joining the regional project, what Brazil did in the past 40 years, roughly, was to invite other countries, South American countries, for example, to be part of its regional integration initiative, mostly thanks to what we call soft leadership, which is basically leadership through diplomacy, right? There's a Brazilian, is called Sean Borges, and he defines Brazil's strategy towards the region as consensual hegemony. It's an expression that I like very much because it kind of translates how Brazil has positioned itself before its neighbors. You can move forward. And finally, soft power has been a central element of Brazil's rise as a 21st century emerging power. So if soft power has been very important for Brazil as a middle power, it has also been strategic for the country's more recent ambitions that pretty much coincides with the Lula administration back in the early 2000s. So Brazil was growing very fast. We were experiencing this commodity boom that basically gave Brazil a lot of international leverage. And now, after Brazil decided it wanted to become an emerging power, Brazil's multilateral engagement, rather than serving as a form of expressing its middle power values, now it serves to make room for Brazil's international or growing international ambitions. So Brazil has adopted, ever since the early 21st century, a fully fledged revisionist agenda, which included reforming the United Nations Security Council, reforming or changing the rules of the World Trade Organization, reforming the Bretton Woods institutions. And in some of those cases, Brazil has also mobilized its soft power and even religious soft power, right? There is a passage by former foreign minister Celso Amorim, who happened to be Lula's foreign minister. He said that Brazil is about to usher in a new form of power based on the use of culture and civilization, not threats. It is a belief in dialogue, not force. So it's very interesting to see how soft power has become a part of Brazil's international identity, even on Brazil's path towards becoming an emerging power. Celso Amorim very often said that he wanted to prove the world that it was possible to be a relevant country only through soft power. I think it's early to tell whether this assumption is actually accurate, especially in the world that we live today. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting to see how Brazil has attempted to use soft power as a very central element of its international identity, no matter how Brazil positioned itself in the world. Amy, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Guilherme. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk briefly because we're running over our time, or we're going to run over our time. Talk briefly about how religious soft power has been used in the service of identity construction here. So I imagine almost everybody on this call, or maybe 100% of everybody on this call, recognizes this figure here, the statue of the Christ the Redeemer based on the Corcovado mountain in Rio. Obviously a religious symbol, which is also a symbol of Brazilian national identity. What those of you who aren't familiar with Brazil may not recognize is the icon or the figure in the religious figure in the bottom of the picture here, which is Nossa Senhora Aparecida, who is a patron saint of Brazil, and she's a Black woman. Okay, so Brazil has been constitutionally, constitutionally speaking, it has been passively secular since the beginning of the Brazilian Republic in 1889. Constitution was passed in 1891. So that the Brazilian state divorced itself. The statesman who wrote the 1891 Constitution effected a moderately hostile divorce or separation between the Brazilian state, the Republic, and the Catholic Church. Historically, however, Brazil as a nation has been overwhelmingly Catholic. When separation of state from church happened in 1889 and 1891, we still have, we don't have religious demographics there, but certainly upwards of 95, 98, 99% of Brazilians have identified as Catholic in that period. So it was an overwhelmingly Catholic country, and this conveyed a religious identity to the nation that Brazilians were constructing. What developed, we argue, is a Catholic civil religion in which the church had, the church was allied with the state as a supporting actor to many things that happened within the state, even to the point that in the late 19th century, following this somewhat hostile divorce between church and state. We have the church then coming in to defend the state to maintain this separation during a sort of a millenarian upstart war, the War of Canudos. So anyway, we have the Brazilian state defending the church, or the Brazilian church, Brazilian Catholic Church defending the state. We have Catholicism that's embedded in national lore, in holidays, in its symbols such as the ones that I've just shown you. And perhaps most symbolically, in the 20th century, in the writings of the anthropologist, he's more than just an academic anthropologist. He's sort of almost a founding figure, founding father in Brazilian conceptualizations of what it means to be Brazilian, Gilberto Freire. So Gilberto Freire is famous for defining Brazil, making the proposition and then popularizing it, that Brazil is a mixed race, mixed culture, mixed social class people where white blends with black, master blends with slave, in his words. So what we're talking about are things like rape and domination. What would today be called rape and domination, but in his telling is a peaceful, peaceful sort of harmony that he's created, that has been created in the Brazilian culture. And this image of Brazil as a mixed race, mixed culture, melting pot really becomes extremely powerful in Brazil and persists to this day in how Brazilians understand themselves. And one of the important things where religion comes in is that Gilberto Freire also defines Brazil as having a mixed syncretic Catholicism, which is to say that it's the blending of slave cultures and indigenous cultures into Catholicism that makes Brazilian religion what it is today. And this is the Brazilian nation. The Brazilian nation is this melting pot of religion. This becomes a statement of Brazilian identity that is also used in the international sphere, defining Brazil as who we are. This is who we are in the international sphere, is this syncretic identity. So then on the international stage, this becomes a quote unquote Christian identity, de-emphasizing the Catholic nature of it and emphasizing that Brazil is part of an international coalition of Christian nations. So this starts to change in the New Democratic period, really. So we have here a figure from my own book, Religious Affiliation in the Brazilian Census. So what this figure shows is that beginning about 1970, we start to see dramatic decline in religious identification as Catholic, where in the 1980 census, for the first time, fewer than 9 in 10 Brazilians identifies as being Catholic. And we start to find increasing religious mixing. So to the point where today, in the 2020 census is not entirely been concluded. But the 2017 census will show that something over 50, slightly over 50% of Brazilians are Catholics. So this is an extraordinary divergence from the story that I've just told you about Gilberto Freire and sort of civil religion of Catholicism. And instead we have a story of religious mixing, religious switching today. The story of Brazil is today the story of religious mixing and religious switching. So under President Lula, a center-left president from the who takes power in 2002, this religious mixing and switching and sort of blooming confusion of religion in Brazil becomes again part of Brazil's international identity on the international stage. As a religiously plural nation and a way to promote Brazil, promote South-South ties between the religiously plural Brazil and other South-South nations. So this, I'm going to stop here and let Guilherme pick up where I've left off and talking about how this identity has then been used for coalition building. Oh, yes, and sorry. And then under Bolsonaro as well, this has been redefined as a sort of in a backlash kind of sense. We've been redefined as we are Christian, really, we are Christian. Forget about this religious pluralism stuff. Everybody else who has switched away from the Christian identity should get over themselves and leave the country. Okay, so I'm gonna hand the baton to Guilherme.
Okay, so so far we've seen that soft power has been a very important part of Brazil's foreign policy strategy, but religion has played a minor role in shaping Brazil's foreign policy. And as Amy Erica has just shown, religion has entered Brazil's diplomatic narrative under President Quadros back in the 1960s, but what he said back then was an uncontroversial statement on Brazil's Christian and Western character. However, more recently, under Presidents Lula and Bolsonaro, religion became a more important piece of Brazil's international identity, first as a pluralistic perspective of Brazil's place in the world. Brazil is a multicultural, multi-religious country, and now under Bolsonaro, Brazil as a Catholic country, or not a Catholic country, but a Christian country, unequivocally. Now, our second hypothesis has to do with international, the forging of international coalitions. In other words, how Brazil has used religion and religious narrative to get closer to some countries, to justify its presence in some of the world affairs. So basically a more realist approach to the use of soft power and religious soft power. Religion has never been central in Brazil's foreign policy strategy, but it has proven itself useful in three fundamental contexts. The first use of religion that became part of religious soft power was to increase Brazilian presence and influence across the global South, especially in Latin America. So we have done a lot of primary research, and we found several speeches by President Lula, for example, making references to God as a part of Brazil's relations with some neighboring countries such as Bolivia and Venezuela. Lula has even gone as far as to say that regional integration in South America was a miracle. So it's very interesting because it's not a consistent usage of religion in Brazil's international narrative, but every time Lula shook hands with a South American president, he made reference to God because he probably understood that that was a way through which Brazil could actually get closer to those countries. The second use of religion in Brazil's foreign policy strategy had to do with raising Brazil's profile on international security matters. So religion was one of the elements in the broad justification that Brazil offered the world whenever Brazil wanted to serve as an honest broker in the Middle East, and more specifically, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So again, President Lula often said that Brazil wanted to play a more specific, a more intense role in negotiating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or helping Israelis and Palestinians to overcome their differences, because Brazil was an ethnic, religious, and culturally harmonious country. And of course, he also made reference to the large Jewish community and the large Arab and Muslim community that we had in Brazil. More Arab than Muslim, really, but religion also played a role in justifying Brazil's interest in the Middle East and Middle Eastern politics as a whole. And finally, religion has been used to expand Brazil's breadth of multilateral interests. So as we said before, since Brazilian soft power has historically related to Brazil's presence in multilateral discussions and multilateral institutions, Brazil wanted to use religion more recently to lead discussions on multilateral issues such as religious intolerance, religious diversity, religious religious cooperation or interfaith dialogue. So back in 2005, for example, Brazil embraced the Turkish-Spanish Alliance of Civilizations, and Brazil was the first non-European country to host a conference, a meeting of the Alliance of Civilizations back in 2010 in Rio. More recently, under Bolsonaro, Brazil has also participated in some initiatives such as the Trump-led International Religious Freedom Alliance. Brazil has positioned itself several times against the persecution of Christians across the world. Brazil has stood up for the traditional concept of family. So all those things, they help us understand how Brazil has somehow instrumentalized its religious characteristic as a foreign policy strategy to get closer to some countries around the world. Amy, back to you.
Hi. Okay, so I'm going to talk now briefly about how religious soft power has been used to construct domestic coalitions as well. So this is a use of religious soft power that has been particularly important in the post-1985 period, we argue. So Brazil transitioned back to democracy from a 21-year military dictatorship in 1985. And this transition back to democracy coincides with the change in the religious landscape that we have just described. That I just described to you guys about 5 to 10 minutes ago. So we have an increasingly plural, increasingly diverse religious landscape, which means that we've got more groups competing for resources and competing in a politicized way for resources. And at the same time, in the post-1985 period, we evolved this tremendously diverse partisan landscape as well, with extremely high multipartism, dysfunctionally high multipartism, where presidents, a system of what's called coalitional presidentialism develops, in which presidents must build coalitions of many, many, many small legislative parties in order to develop a coalition. What this does is empower sort of pluralist interest groups, including religious groups. Okay, so one of the ways we see this is in building domestic coalitions is particularly under the Bolsonaro administration. We see evangelicals have become an interest group lobbying the Bolsonaro administration in particular, though they did have lobbied prior administrations as well. We're focusing here on the Bolsonaro administration, in part, partially because Bolsonaro has been particularly receptive. In recent years, evangelicals have been very active in opposing gender ideology, both domestically, what they call gender ideology, which is effectively LGBT rights, and to some extent women's rights as well, are summed up under the term gender ideology under this conservative label. So they have, the evangelical groups are opposing gender ideology domestically, but also very strongly on the international sphere, again, perceiving themselves as part of sort of an international rightist coalition, and really strongly at the United Nations. Evangelicals are opposing this, Brazilian evangelicals are opposing this at the UN, which has led to the National Association of Evangelical Jurists, ANAJURI, to seek observer status at the UN, which Bolsonaro has strongly been supporting. We've also seen this recently in a fight, a tussle over whether the Brazilian embassy would be moved to Jerusalem, where on the one hand, the Trump administration and evangelicals were pushing for Brazil to move its embassy to Jerusalem. And on the other hand, agribusiness interests, in particular the halal industry. Brazil has the largest, I believe, I'm pretty sure it's the largest in the world, the largest halal industry in the entire world. Yeah, it is the largest halal industry in the entire world, is oddly located in Brazil, where it's not for domestic consumption, it's entirely for export, or almost entirely for export. So the halal industry was really, really opposed to the move of the Brazilian embassy to Jerusalem. Ultimately, it was not moved to Jerusalem. They opened a trade office there, which really upset about just about everybody on all sides of the issue. We also see this in a competition among, we see the use of religious soft power on the international sphere for the purpose of domestic interest group competition in, for instance, the fight over a concordat with the Holy See that the Lula, President Lula administration concluded in 2008. So he very quickly pushed through rather abruptly pushed through a concordat with the Holy See in 2008, which mostly reaffirmed its longstanding Brazilian law about the rights of the Catholic Church, but did include a few new rights for the Catholic Church, such as tax privileges for Catholic entities other than churches. In any case, regardless of what the actual terms were of the concordat, evangelical groups saw this as really quite threatening, particularly at the beginning. Over time, they became less threatened by it. But beginning in 2009, they demanded the same treatment for themselves. So a legislative initiative began in 2009 that ultimately concluded in a law in 2016 that basically took the terms of the concordat and made it apply to all religious groups, gave all of the same privileges to all religious groups. We also see sort of this tussle over diplomatic passports. It's a really interesting story that I'm not going to go into here, but suffice it to say that every little church wants its own diplomatic passport. And this is a holdover from a time when the Catholic Church got privileges for its own domestic, its own passports. That privilege has been taken away, and now every church is fighting for its own passports. Okay, I'm going to pass the baton back to Guilherme, who will take us over the finish line.
Okay, there's just one last episode, which is very recent. It actually happened after we wrote our chapter, that relates to Brazil's Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which happens to be a major church, evangelical, neo-Pentecostal church in Brazil, and they have put a lot of pressure on the Bolsonaro administration to make sure that Brazil would intervene in a dispute between local Universal Church pastors and Brazilian Universal Church pastors in Angola. And it's curious because Brazil, in spite of all its diplomatic clout, it lost the tug of war with the local pastors. But it was interesting to see how Brazil decided to interfere in an otherwise private matter involving a specific Brazilian church, as though the church was part of the state. Obviously has a lot to do with religious lobbying that we see and that Amy spoke about. Now, to summarize, you can go to the next topic, please. So yeah, to summarize, over the 20th century, we had a consensus. Religion played a small role in Brazilian foreign policy. Catholicism was largely an uncontroversial element of Brazil's national identity up until the 1980s or 1990s. And whenever, the few times Brazil decided to evoke Christianity was just to justify its coalition with the West, especially during the Cold War, when being part of the West mattered so that the United States could make sure that Brazil was a loyal ally. Under President Lula, we saw a greater use of religion in Brazilian foreign policy, mostly to shape Brazil's national identity and to redefine it as a pluralistic country in terms of religion. And also, we saw a strategic use of the Christian identity with several mentions of God to justify foreign policy for Latin America and especially for South America. Next slide, please. Under Bolsonaro, finally, we saw a very different usage of religion in Brazilian foreign policy and in Brazilian politics. We can say that under Bolsonaro, the lines between the secular state and religion have been blurred completely. National identity was once again redefined as a Christian country, but now as a militantly Christian country. We also saw a strategic use of Christian identity to justify alliance with the United States and with other global right-wing governments such as Hungary, Italy, Poland, Israel, because Israel is seen as part of this Judeo-Christian tradition. And finally, there was the strategic use of Christian identity to bolster domestic coalitions to favor some big religious groups, such as Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, the Assembly of God, which happen to be some of Bolsonaro's most loyal and important allies, not only because they are politically relevant, but also because they have a large number of members of the House of Representatives and Senate in Brazil. So as our conclusion, for what purposes have various presidents deployed religious soft power in the case of Brazil? So first of all, to construct national identity. So we have shown that this national identity narrative has been part of Brazil's foreign policy at least since the 1960s. The second hypothesis was to build coalitions vis-a-vis international actors, especially in South America and Latin America, but also in the Middle East. We have mobilized those religious elements of Brazilian identity to justify Brazil's growing interest in some faraway regions or some unusual issues in international relations. And finally, to maintain domestic political coalitions for democratic competition. Just a quick reminder, Brazil is a presidential system, but we have 35 parties which scramble permanently for power. So the role of evangelical parties or predominantly evangelical parties have become very central to Brazil's democracy, and especially to make sure that Bolsonaro will be able to finish his term in office. I think this is it. Thank you so much for the audience, and now we can go to the Q&A.
Wonderful, Guilherme and Amy Erica. Thank you so much for this fantastic overview and analysis. As you mentioned, we have some time now, about 15 minutes or so for discussion and Q&A. We already actually have 6 questions that have come in since we started. For those of you, just a reminder, who would like to ask questions of our speakers, although recognizing we're already going to be hard pressed to get through the ones that have come in, you can do so by clicking the Q&A control at the bottom of your screen and typing your question into that box. Some of the questions have some resonances with each other, so we may get some efficiency just by grouping a couple of them. Okay. If I may, I'd like to start by asking you a question about a specific dimension of the South-South aspect of religion in Brazil's soft power, or simply the transnational, sort of religious transnationalism. One of the most commonly observed aspects of global religious demography in recent decades, of course, has been the enormous growth in evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity in the global South, particularly in Africa. And of course, that includes a number of countries in Africa that are Portuguese speaking. And so I wanted to ask if you had any information or thoughts to share on kind of Brazil's transnational religious ties with Lusophone Africa, particularly.
I can take this, Guilherme, or you may want to talk.
Okay.
So the anecdote that Guilherme is referring to at the end there in Angola is part of a larger story. So yes, Brazil sends missionaries to Africa, Brazilian evangelical churches in particular, and particularly Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal churches, churches from the Assemblies of God, Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, many other domestic churches send missionaries to Lusophone Africa. Yes, so there's tremendous amount of cross-national evangelical work and missionary work happening. And in fact, this is, this has become a part of the life of Brazilian evangelical churches. Is often, just we're going to raise money in the same way that American churches are raising money to send missionaries. Brazilian evangelical churches are raising money to send missionaries on a regular basis to Africa, and supporting their own missionaries in Africa. So there's tremendous amount here. The most politicized of the churches that has been sending missionaries has been the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, where there are many political controversies here concerns about money laundering. There have been at various points in time concerns about money laundering. The Universal Church of the Kingdom of God also is extremely protective of its own identity and will go after reporters who report on this kind of thing to try to shut down reporting on this kind of thing. So it becomes very difficult to report on and to trace the international connections. And there is not really sufficient information out there on what's going on in terms of these various possible scandals and international threats. The particular scandal that Guilherme is referring to is one that involves apparent abuse, racist abuse from Brazilian pastors against Angolese and parishioners or church members in Angola. So yeah, so yes, this is happening and it is affecting international politics. And this is part of what's going on with the many diplomatic passports, sort of minor scandals that are happening, is that people are getting passports in part so they can do missionary work.
One important thing about the Universal Church, Peter, is that the Universal Church has never actually resorted to diplomatic interference to solve their local problems with local actors. So that's very new when it comes to Brazilian foreign policy, to engage in a private matter just because, I mean, to publicly engage, because it could happen in the backstage, but in this case, it was a public thing. The thing about the Universal Church is that they are very controversial because they have expanded very aggressively in the last 30 years. And not only to Lusophone Africa, I mean, their largest follower base in Africa is actually in South Africa. And I think a student of mine did this wonderful research on the strategies of internationalization of the Universal Church. And basically what we found was that Brazil, the Universal Church in particular, they're looking for countries that speak Portuguese because it's actually easier. They don't need to be trained in other languages. But I think that the main reason why they internationalize their businesses or their religious matters is because they are looking for countries with a similar profile of Brazil. So especially countries that have huge inequality, and especially in urban areas, countries that have a lot of localized poverty. One of the nicknames of the Universal Church in countries like Peru or Bolivia is "Stop Suffering." So they give some spiritual advice and spiritual comfort. So, and some of those countries have even gone as far as to ban the Universal Church. And they've even changed their local names so they could keep operating. So I'd say that it goes beyond Lusophone Africa. It's more like a South-South relationship. But even in the outskirts of Portuguese cities, British cities, or even the United States, where you have large Latino communities, the Universal Church and some other Brazilian churches are also there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to a question that was asked by a couple of people. So David Kane points out that especially during his campaign, Bolsonaro referred to the Catholic Church, at least the CNBB, as a sort of political adversary. How has the CNBB and larger church related to the president? Would you say it's been adversarial? And James McCarville asks a similar question, simply, how has the Catholic evangelical competition played out in domestic issues in Brazil?
Okay, the Catholic Church has played a very intense role in Brazil's redemocratization process back in the 1980s. And it happened mostly through the hands of the National Conference of Bishops in Brazil, which is CNBB, as somebody mentioned here. I think it was, I don't know exactly who mentioned the CNBB.
It was David Kane, and I already removed the
David.
question.
So so CNBB, it was an opposing group to the military regime back in the day. Some of the high-ranked CNBB members were part of the liberation theology, which is often identified as a left-leaning theology within the Catholic Church. So the CNBB, they have had a very important role back in the 1980s. they've been an important actor throughout the Brazilian democratic period from the 1980s up until very recently. But I'd say that when it comes to Bolsonaro, they have maintained a position of mild opposition. They do not really confront Bolsonaro, especially because there's so many Catholic supporters of Bolsonaro. So CNBB doesn't really want to get involved in petty politics. But I'd say that when it comes to those religious disputes within the state, and especially when it comes to the Bolsonaro administration, Bolsonaro did a very, very savvy thing, a savvy move, political move, because he's a Catholic. He was born and raised a Catholic. But he was baptized back in 2016. He went to Israel and he was baptized in the Jordan River as an evangelical. And it sent mixed signals to the Brazilian audience, because to some groups, he's okay with identifying himself as an evangelical, but to some other group, he maintains his original Catholic identity. So he has allowed Bolsonaro to navigate those two different realities. And even though I'd say that in practice, Bolsonaro really favors evangelical groups. For example, out of the 24 ministers of his cabinet, 9 or 10 are evangelical. Our Minister of Education is an evangelical Christian. I mean, a pastor. He used to run an evangelical university here in Sao Paulo. So he clearly favors evangelicals as a political group, or as a combination of political groups. But I'd say that many Catholic supporters are actually pretty happy, because they also believe in the same things evangelicals believe, such as pro-life rather than pro-choice, anti-LGBT rights. So in a way, Catholic supporters are happy. Even though they are not a specific part of his administration, they feel contemplated with everything Bolsonaro has been doing, especially when it comes to those more conservative agendas that he's pushing forward.
I would say, sorry, hi again. I would say really quickly, one thing that Bolsonaro has been really very effective and strategic in creating and trying to tamp down inter-religious group cleavages between Catholics and evangelicals. Well, there certainly are controversies that he is exacerbating. He's really trying not to identify himself as either with the evangelicals or with the Catholics. His rhetoric is, I think, very explicitly and deliberately not identifiable with any symbol of either Catholicism or evangelicalism, but with Christianity and the Brazilian national identity as a whole. Yeah. And he sees himself as part of this global Christian right that is not either Catholic or evangelical.
The only religious symbol that Bolsonaro has explicitly used was a box of hydroxychloroquine. One day he went in the middle of the crowd and he rose a box of hydroxychloroquine to say, "Here is the miracle drug that's going to save Brazilian lives." And yeah, we know the end of the story, right?
Okay, so our next question, and just to given the time, this may end up being our last question. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get through all of them. Please rest assured that we will make sure that our speakers see all of the questions, and there are other ways you can follow up with them, and maybe we'll need to have them back for a part 2. It's good though, because this is a forward-looking question. It comes from Lucas Tibau, who asks whether religious nationalism in Brazil as it exists today will be able to survive in its current strength in the post-Bolsonaro period. Regarding Brazil's foreign policy, what are the medium and longer term impacts and prospects for this new religiously linked nationalist rhetoric that you identified?
That's a fascinating question. And so evangelicalism and the religious right in Brazil is not going away. It is here to stay in Brazilian politics. Whether this will be strategically utilized by right-wing presidents really depends on the presidents. So this is Brazilian foreign policy is an area where the presidents have a great deal of discretion, among the areas where presidents have greatest discretion. And so it is entirely conceivable that if we end up with, say, a center-rightist or center-leftist president following Bolsonaro, that that we will not see this particular use in foreign policy, though the Brazilian, again, the right is here to stay. I don't know if that's Guilherme's perspective.
Many evangelical leaders are happy with financial government support. So now they've realized that they could join forces to get a president elected. So this is a completely different game. But they've supported left-leaning governments such as Lula's or Rousseff's back in the early 2010s or 2000s. So it's curious because now they have understood that the kind of pressure they can exert if they want to get their conservative agenda forward. But there was not a precondition for support back in the day. So we might not fool ourselves into believing that, well, we are going to live in an evangelical theocracy. That's not the case. But I agree with Amy Erica that our religious right is here to stay. It's much like the United States. Even when Bolsonaro goes away, we'll still see a lot of people. I'd say that he has been able to convince the 30% that really support him that Brazil is a godly nation, that Brazil is a nation that belongs to God. So I think that these 30% will be around putting pressure in different ways to convince lawmakers that they have to pass conservative legislation and so on and so forth. But of course, it depends on the president to arrange the place of evangelical and Christians in general in the coalition. I see no other candidate, no other politician other than Bolsonaro. Of course, there are pastors out there, but no other mainstream politician using religious groups to advance a 100% conservative agenda, as Bolsonaro has been trying to do. Other politicians will try to make their way into bringing those religious groups in different fashions. Just one question that I saw here related to the Biden administration. It's curious because Bolsonaro was probably one of the few presidents, if not the only president, who actually campaigned for Trump, and that, of course, caused a lot of controversy with the Biden administration. In Brazil, and especially pastors, we see like pastors who are lawmakers as well. What they say about the Biden administration is that Biden is a socialist. And I remember that out of the, I don't know, tens of executive orders he signed on his first day in office, the Brazilian evangelicals singled out the one that has to do with like transgender bathrooms or something like that. And they made a fuss around this because they thought, well, this is unequivocal evidence that Biden is a socialist and he's, I don't know, he's acting on behalf of Satan or something like that. So they are pretty much against Biden. And as a last thought about this, if Bolsonaro tries to come closer to the United States, which will be something very reasonable to do, he will probably face the opposition of some of his supporters who think that Biden is a socialist.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have unfortunately reached the end of our time today. I want to first and foremost thank our speakers, Professors Casaroes and Smith, for their fantastic presentation. Obrigado for giving us such a rich and a wide-ranging discussion. You can see from the number of questions we had that there was really a great engagement with everything that you shared. I want to make sure that our audience knows that the next webinar session in this series is actually less than a week away. It'll be taking place next Wednesday on February 17th, when Dr. Claudia Baumgart-Osse of the Frankfurt Peace Research Institute will be discussing Israel's religious soft power. And you'll find in the chat box a link that will allow you to register for that so that you can join us next week as well. My thanks as ever to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all of our events here at the Berkeley Center, and all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. Finally, let me join the Berkeley Center's Director and Managing Director, Sean Casey, and Michael Kessler in thanking all of you for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.